There's no subject that faces up to mere ignorance than that of the subject of economics, and I've been requested numerous times before in the past to respond on a channel titled Unlearning Economics.
Today we're going to be talking about capitalism. Capitalism is something that a lot of people on Breadtube don't really seem to like.
Oh yeah, here it comes, baby. The generic 10-minute rant about how capitalism is bad that I do at the end of every video now.
Capitalism is just, it's so ingrained in us that we refuse to advance for the sake of a handful of huge wallets.
And you know what? I'm not a massive fan either. But there are few videos which really attempt to get to grips with the economics of capitalism. The best and most viewed, which as we all know are the same thing, is the two-part series by ContraPoints. As usual, Natalie's videos are entertaining and insightful. She repeatedly associates capitalism with evil reptiles who have all the money and power and aren't the Jews, to be clear. She takes us through some of the paradoxes and absurdities of contemporary capitalism, which she observes and critiques effectively, including class conflict, shitty jobs, consumerism, and inequality. And yet, somehow, the whole thing feels like less than the sum of its parts. The issue, I think, is that ultimately the videos lack a coherent theory of what capitalism is and how it works.
I can't think of anything more incoherent than a person who tries to pull capitalism outside of individualism and then tries to relabel a mixed economy as if that's a capitalist system.
In fact, we don't even get a definition of capitalism. One thing I want to acknowledge early on is that, as always, Natalie definitely knows more than she lets on in the videos. She's simplifying because she wants to make things accessible, and because the old white dudes who populate economics and philosophy piss her off. I also know that when Natalie says things like,
I mean, I'm not an economic theorist, and honestly, I don't really understand how the economy works.
She's at least partly joking. But whatever the reason, I think there are elements of her videos that could be cleared up and developed. I'm going to mostly take her at her word because, you know, what else can I do?
Well, I've responded on ContraPoints before. As nice as the person is, she just doesn't have a clue what she's going on about. He's basically going to try and pull capitalism outside of individualism, like the mental gymnastics that they always do, and correlate it to that of collectivism. That's right, another word for socialism.
To that end, I'm going to focus quite a lot on what she calls the argument.
Capitalism as we know it is a defective economic system because, although it's good at creating large amounts of wealth, it distributes that wealth in an incredibly inefficient way, where efficiency is understood not as the capacity to maximize total wealth, but as the capacity to maximize human happiness.
To start with, despite her main conclusion revolving around wealth creation and distribution, it's not clear to me from her videos how capitalism either creates wealth or distributes wealth. To answer the age-old question of how wealth is created, we will have to go back to the man many consider the founding father of economics, whose work has remained relevant for hundreds of years. That's right, the 14th century Islamic scholar Ibn Khaldun. 400 years before Adam Smith, Ibn Khaldun observed that through specialization and cooperation, human beings can produce much more than they need. But what is obtained through the cooperation of a group of human beings satisfies the need of a number many times greater than themselves. For instance, no one, by himself, can obtain the share of the wheat he needs for food. But when 6 or 10 persons, including a smith and a carpenter to make the tools, and others who are in charge of the oxen, the ploughing of the soil, the harvesting of the ripe grain, and all other agricultural activities, undertake to obtain their food, that amount will be food for a number of people many times their own.
So the problem with his argument is that food isn't just all one. Of course, back in those days, they never really had a staple diet. You've got to look at the fact that individual consumer demand is all different from one another. It's not all the same. You can't afford, when it comes to food, with regards to it having a sell-by date and all the rest of that, you can't afford to just mass produce and say, oh well, here's a certain amount for everybody, and everybody just gets the same in the same quantity and this many times over, blah blah blah. There's enough for everyone. Expectations far exceed economic reality. In other words, scarcity. That's what defines scarcity. Being all different from one another, it's not something that when you're speaking about efficiency that you can just afford to just mass produce whatever it is. So you need to know how much of what to produce of each and every single food item, and the only way that you're going to know that is through consumer demand dictating what prices are. Through the economic calculation problem that his type would end up causing, he would end up creating the very inefficiency that of course ContraPoints mentions about.
When workers specialise in different tasks within production units such as farms or factories, This is a source of surplus above and beyond what they need. Khaldun didn't stop there. He linked the technical division of labour to the gains from trade. If the labour of the inhabitants of a town or city is distributed in accordance with the necessities and needs of those inhabitants, a minimum of that labour will suffice. The labour available is more than is needed. Consequently, it is spent to provide the conditions and customs of luxury, and to satisfy the needs of the inhabitants of other cities. They import the things they need from people who have a surplus through exchange or purchase. Thus, the people who have a surplus get a good deal of wealth. Different production units, cities, or even countries have different specializations and trade with each other in order to attain more wealth than they could manage alone. One way of thinking about this is to call it the social division of labour, across rather than within production units. One city might specialize in food while another specializes in clothes, and by trading, they can produce more clothes and food in total than they could if they worked alone.
So I don't know where he's gone with this argument, because at the end of the day, even within this mixed economy, in the presence of capitalism to some extent, you do have businesses that can mass produce, clothing, etc, etc. There's efficiency because the market's driven by prices and prices fluctuate, and therefore businesses can react with all the variety of different products. In those days, things were much more simplistic. It's not as complex today where you see all these hundreds of different companies, etc., and all the variety of different clothing companies and the hundreds and hundreds of different clothing items where it's all different from one another. Every single cloth item you could possibly think of in one store, never let alone every other store, you're going to have to know how much to produce of each and every single item. Now, if you were to take today's principle with his argument would collapse in on its arse. You can't just afford to just mass produce for the sake of it and then have a surplus and then just guess. Since we've got a surplus, we'll just allocate it, to another country or another city or something, and therefore, through this trade, people just get what they want. Well, that isn't the case, because we saw from the Soviet Union where the central planner tried to mass produce more than 3 pairs of shoes. The reason why there was big, massive, long waiting lines is because the shoes that the central planner produced did not meet the tastes of the consumer. What really determines, production is down to the consumer, and that's how things should be. What is going to be produced, how much is going to be produced, through consumer demand driving production and determining what prices are. But that isn't the case with these people. They think it's just a case that you can centrally plan, and as if clothing is all just one. Each and every single individual consumer is all different from one another. That's the issue.
I haven't mentioned capitalism yet. Surplus and the division of labour were common to settled civilizations long before capitalism, ever since the dawn of agriculture, which was Khaldun's example. He was writing in a time and place where what we recognise as capitalism hadn't really taken root, although I have put some interesting debates over the Islamic origins of capitalism in the description.
He's talking garbage, folk. Capitalism derives from meritocracy, which dates back to the first days of barter thousands of years ago. What's he going on about? Even the ancient argument between individualism and collectivism goes all the way back to ancient Greece. So clearly he's not even got a clue about history or capitalism.
The economist Stephen Marjolin took issue with Adam Smith's account of the division of labour, not because it was descriptively wrong, but because it missed the role of the capitalist in organisation. Like Khaldun before him, Smith tended to assume that the division of labour was arrived at for reasons of technical efficiency. People somehow realised that through specialisation they could produce more, and this specialisation resulted in greater skills and new technologies. Marjolin points out, though, that there were many examples where the methods used in independent cottage industries were at least as productive as the methods used in early factories. For this reason, early capitalism was filled with all sorts of legal restrictions on production, which pushed workers into factories, including restrictions on how many looms could be held in a home. Rather than increasing efficiency, that is, getting more output for less input.
The reason why the mothers and children went to work in the factories, etc., was because they viewed the factories as salvation, because they were basically starving to death. They had no food to cook with and no food on their tables, so of course they were going to view the factories as salvation. He's trying to make it sound as if these people were somehow forced into working in the factories, which just isn't the case, and somehow it was down to certain restrictions. Nothing at all to do with restrictions at all. Was the British Industrial Revolution something strongly capitalist? No. It was dominated by mercantilism. Of course, he doesn't tell you that.
This leads us to our definition. Capitalism is a system where production is privately owned by capitalists, who employ workers paid in wages and sell their produce on markets.
How convenient of them to ignore the fact that capitalism is defined around that of individualism. Of course, they always leave that out because they want to try and desperately try and correlate capitalism to what you see today with collectivism, but they can't, because capitalism is antonymous to the word collectivism. Collectivism is another word for socialism, and the reason why they leave that out is because individualism essentially defines the freedom of individuals to pursue their own economic goals and paths in the absence of government regulation. In other words, capitalism is defined around that of the market regulating itself. And the reason why they leave that out is because it was through all their socialism, through their socialist price fixing, through that of their socialist fixing of the interest rates, etc., that caused the boom and bust cycle. That's why they leave it out.
It should be emphasised that the rise of capitalism was accompanied by a lot of misery for the workers, as well as by the subjugation of women and by colonialism and slavery overseas. I don't want to gloss over any of this, and by the end of this video, you'll see how they can be accounted for by our analysis.
Typical socialist, a compulsive liar. And there you go, trying to correlate collectivism, which is basically imperialism and colonialism, with that of an individualist system known as capitalism. You see, that is the very reason why you don't bother with the whole left versus right with these people. If you want to flatten these people, you force them onto individualism versus collectivism. Folk, the evidence I've pointed out before, and I'll show it again, these people are compulsive liars. They utterly despise the fact that an antonym for collectivism is capitalism. The definition of antonym is very clear. It means a word that is opposite in meaning of another word in the same language, right? That's what an antonym means. Capitalism is the opposite in meaning to the entire meaning of collectivism. It means capitalism's got nothing to do with collectivism whatsoever. So how the fuck did he draw to the logical conclusion that both collectivist systems, imperialism and colonialism, somehow has something to do with capitalism? This is the very reason why they are desperate to try and pull capitalism outside of individualism, because they want to try and project the blame off onto capitalism. Imperialism and colonialism are just branches of collectivism. In other words, they're branches of socialism, state direction of the economy as a whole. Of course, they don't like that fact. It's just like how they don't like the fact that fascism is a branch of socialism, because it's all to do with collectivism. So when you're speaking about this to do with the period of the subjugation of women, what a complete and utter bullshit lie that really is, folk. One of the greatest lies that these people have ever told of the Industrial Revolution period of history. Why? For the first time in human history, when you go before the Industrial Revolution, when you go way back to the Paleolithic period, right up to the start of the Industrial Revolution, women were under the thumb of the male counterpart. That is to say, women had no freedom whatsoever. For the first time in human history, because of the factories, and they were not forced into working in them. That's another myth that they tried to spread about the Industrial Revolution. They were not forced into working in those factories. And the mothers even had the power to prevent their children working in them. The reason why they didn't is because they were going to die of starvation. The mothers, for the first time, could actually make a wage for themselves independently. It gave them financial independence. And he tries to repaint history, spread the typical Marxist lie, and says that somehow women were subjugated. Utter bullshit. And again, when it comes down to the whole living and working conditions, a socialist critic, a socialist historian, E.P. Thompson, was forced into a concession to concede to the fact that living and working conditions had actually improved throughout the first industrial revolution between the 1790s right up to the 1840s. You actually had E.P. Thompson forced into the concession that children had always worked long before the Industrial Revolution, you know, working endless hours from day until night on the farms. They don't touch upon any of that because the fact is, before the Industrial Revolution, their living and working conditions were actually more dangerous and were worse off than that of the earliest, poorest factories, than that of the early and the first Industrial Revolution. There was no collapse of living standards. That's the problem, because these people tried to compare the living and working conditions back then in the 1830s, etc., and then they compare it to today's living conditions and wages, etc., etc. That's not how you measure progress. You don't look at today's living conditions and wages and look back then and say, oh, look at the conditions back then, that was so awful. Well, of course, you're looking at it from today's perspective. How about actually looking at what life was like before the Industrial Revolution and then looking at that period? Oh no, they don't do that. Why? Because it changes the entire narrative. And you could even look at this graph where you can see the growth of the Industrial Revolution. It was unprecedented. These socialists pull off this mental gymnastics to try and claim, oh, look how awful their living and working conditions were like. How was their living and working conditions like before the Industrial Revolution? Again, they don't touch upon that.
We have a solid start on how wealth is created under capitalism.
You see, this is a lie because all you've done is shown a picture of that to do with slavery, as if to correlate that to do with capitalism, and the slavery existed for millennia, dating right back to ancient Egypt, all the way through ancient Greece and ancient Rome, all the way up to the period of 1833. So it wasn't the fault of individualism, and individualism didn't really come around until, on the question of scale that is, when you're moving away from feudalism towards the Industrial Revolution. So there was, to some extent, a level of individualism. Again, I say on a question of scale, because you didn't have full-blown individualism as such. You didn't really have a strong free market economy. It was strongly mercantilist, but there was, to some extent, a level of individualism to some level. What you saw was a faster real wage earning growth rate between 1820 to 1850 over and above the 0.55% real wage earning growth rate between 1780 to 1820. It's because governments had led us to wars between 1756 to 1815. In other words, all your imperialism and colonialism, that's right, your socialism, your wonderful collectivism, held society back. That's why there was a slower real wage earning growth rate in statistics. How convenient of you to completely ignore that fact and try and project, just like the typical narcissist that you are, try and project the blame off elsewhere. Because that's all you socialists ever do. And you always love to try and repaint history all to suit your own agenda. Complete nonsense of what you're spouting. Because the reality is that what you saw was wealth creation from capitalism being created because people were free to do so. That's why there was faster growth when free trade came around in 1843. What held people back, however, was imposing an income tax in 1843 and then bombing the British people with high income tax rate in 1847 thanks to your socialist pish.
So we need to talk about the other part of ContraPoint's argument, the unequal distribution of this wealth. And to do that, we need to turn to another thinker who has recently tried to make sense of capitalism. If you follow trends in economics, you may have heard of the best-selling 2014 book Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty.
Yes, that's right, Thomas Piketty. Now, of course, Thomas E. Woods Jr. and that of Robert P. Murphy touched upon that of Thomas Piketty in his work before. Again, I can leave the source for you. You can go and watch this for yourself and you can listen to their argument. What you find from Thomas Piketty, he's not even got a clue about economics. And of course, he gets his dates wrong even on the Great Depression. So I wouldn't even take someone like him seriously. And as for the socialists, I think they only got to like page 20 and they cut themselves off and then pretended that somehow they knew everything. I've got to laugh at you. See, ever since you socialists took away our free market money, which was gold and silver, and then you socialists imposed upon the market a fiat currency and started printing it out of thin air, how the hell did you create wealth equality? Was it wealth equality when you started running the printing press? Meaning that the devaluation of the currency meant that people were buying less, whereas the rich are holding all the assets. Now, of course, they invested in all that. That's not their problem. Inevitably creating a wealth gap between the rich and poor through running the printing press, and that's what your socialism requires. You have the audacity to even sit there and speak about wealth inequality, and I don't even concern myself over that issue. I don't even concern myself over anything. See, so long as the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting richer, Who the bloody hell cares? When he goes on about this to do with the wealth inequality and stuff, I'm not interested in all of that, and he doesn't even understand what wealth is anyway. Wealth isn't to do with the wages that you earn, etc. It's to do with basically the productivity, the material possessions, what you can buy with it, etc. And when you look throughout the Industrial Revolution, due to the mass production, people, especially the poor, were far richer by the late 19th century compared to what they were back in 1780s. All that matters is the rich grew richer and the poor grew richer faster, and that's all I'm concerned about. I'm no concerned about, making the rich equal foot on that with everybody else. I mean, this is what they are concerned about. All they look at is what the rich are earning, and that's it. Again, you can check out the wealth statistics, and you can see, even comparing before that of the Industrial Revolution between 1650 to 1700, and then compare that to 1850, and this is talking about Great Britain, you can actually see that the poor were getting richer. That's all that matters, folk.
Based on his framework, where a small number of people own wealth, which grows faster than incomes, Piketty goes on to predict increasing inequality in the future, and is concerned about the political power that these owners will exert as their relative wealth increases.
I've quoted this before, and I'll show it again. This was basically Thomas J. DiLorenzo. He pointed this out in How Capitalism Saved America, and you can see that there was no dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. He's contradicted because even in the United States between 1840 to 1900, the division of income remained the same, with 70% going to the workers, and of course the remaining 30% to that of the capital and resource suppliers. Do you realise how much that contradicts these pathological liars? And that's what they are. They're pathological liars. They'll be confronted on their lies, and then they'll try and put lies on top of lies. That's who these people are, right? The reason why that contradicts them is because this was during the period of the myth of the robber barons. That's right. Period that they tried to lie about, tried to claim that there was all these monopolies, as if they say, giant trust came around, and it's like, oh my god, man. Oh, what are we going to do? It's like the fucking sky's caving in. We're all going to fucking die. It's like they've concentrated all the wealth into the hands of the few. What are we going to do? Instead, wealth remained the same in terms of wealth redistribution, in terms of the division of income. When they go on about this dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, they're just spouting crap, folk. And ever since the days after the Industrial Revolution, what you saw was corporatism. As more and more government would interfere with that of, thanks to socialism, you would see the rise of corporatism. And of course, what did the socialists do as usual? Just like the narcissists that they are, they tried to project the blame off onto capitalism. It's just classic socialist mentality.
Piketty's own data show that when slavery was abolished, there was a concomitant reduction in the wealth ratio and capital share. But nothing concrete had actually happened to capitalist stuff.
Folk, I don't know where he gets that logic from, because what you saw between 1840 right up to about 1900 was the consumer price index continuously fell, and society as a whole was getting richer. Where on earth does he draw to that logical conclusion? There was higher levels of productivity. It's just like I said, he was wrong on the Great Depression, so I'm not bloody well surprised that he would hit out with that nonsense. So I don't know what position this guy particularly sits with. I don't know whether he's a Marxist or he supports the mixed economy. I'm not entirely sure what he sits with. But obviously he's got a big problem with that of capitalism. The problem is he's not living under a capitalist system. He's living under corporatism, because you can't have a mixed economy without corporatism. If not, then he's going down the road of supporting this of full-blown socialism. So that means getting rid of the private sector. How then is he going to pay people wages? Running the printing press, which is just going to drive the country into hyperinflation. These people are clueless, yet he wants to make himself sound as if he's an intellectual. He calls himself, pure narcissist, typical narcissist, calls himself an intellectual. Yeah, an intellectual, but doesn't even understand that you require the private sector to rationally finance the economy in order to pay people wages. If you're going to strangle the private sector half to death, how the hell are you helping the poor? Because all you're doing by strangling the private sector half to death is driving the private sector cost through the roof. Why else do you think you saw the monopolisation, the cartels and the oligopolies? You didn't see that because of a free market. You saw it historically because of government's intervention, and you saw the private sector costs get out of control. Just look at the main American healthcare market as a prime example of what all the government intervention had created. It's a contradiction of all that rhetoric he spouts. He likes to sound intellectual about helping the poor but strangling the private sector half to death. Being an anti-capitalist is apparently helping the poor. So on one hand, they'll sit and piss and moan about corporatism and the giant corporations, but at the same time, they'll sit and claim that somehow socialism's going to solve the problem. Socialism's going to somehow, save you from all of that. Well, how is it? It was their socialist government interventionism that led to this very corporatist system. I've went on long enough, but I think that just epitomises everything. Anyway, folk, if you've got anything you would like to ask, comment in the comment section below. Be sure to like the video, share the video, and of course, thank you for watching. I shall talk to you later. Cheers.